Some people don't wear medals, they carry the weight in silence. Harrison Ford wasn't on the guest list that morning. No cameras waited for him, no welcome committee stood by, but he showed up anyway, quiet, unannounced. And by the time the ceremony ended, the entire base had changed, not because of who he was, but because of what he did. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories like this coming your way. San Diego Naval Base wasn't used to mystery. Every corner of the grounds was swept clean, every uniform pressed within an inch of perfection. The Echo Shield ceremony was about to begin, an event closed to press, public, and even half the Navy itself. Only authorized names were allowed through the gate, and each of them had been verified twice. No room for error, no room for surprises, but then one showed up. He didn't arrive in a car. He didn't stop at the checkpoint. He walked. His boots were worn, jeans frayed at the hem. A leather jacket hugged his shoulders, the kind that once flew planes and carried scars. A canvas duffel bag bounced gently against his hip as he moved, slow, steady, like a man who had nowhere to be but everywhere to go. His face was partly shadowed by a sun-faded baseball cap, pulled low. The wind tugged at the flags above, snapping them with ceremony. He didn't flinch. He didn't ask for directions. He just kept walking. A few guests noticed. One lieutenant narrowed his eyes but said nothing. A civilian contractor whispered, "Who let that guy in?" But no one moved, not until a voice barked across the concrete. "Sir, this area is restricted." Petty Officer Raymond Knox didn't like irregularities. The clipboard in his hand held the entire guest list, and he checked it like scripture. The man before him wasn't on it. That was enough. Knox stepped closer, mirrored sunglasses reflecting the stranger's chest, not his eyes. "You need to leave. This is an official event." No response. The man adjusted the strap on his bag. His fingers were steady. Knox's lips tightened. "Final warning." He didn't wait for a response this time. He raised his water bottle and without ceremony tipped it forward. Ice water splashed against the stranger's shoulder, trailing down his collar like an accusation. The plastic clicked against the concrete. Silence. The man blinked. Once. That was all. He didn't raise his voice, didn't even raise his hand, just stood there, the water soaking into his jacket, his jaw set but not clenched. Calm like this had happened before. Chairs creaked in the distance. A few guests shifted in their seats, unsure whether to look or look away. A murmur spread but found no words to cling to. Knox squared his stance, emboldened. "You're not on the list. That's not a suggestion, it's an order." Still nothing, but someone somewhere was already whispering, not loud enough to be heard yet, but close. Because something about that man didn't sit right. It wasn't just the silence, or the clothes, or the way he didn't fight back. It was the weight in his presence, the kind that doesn't come from rank or fame, the kind that can't be taught. No one knew his name, not yet, but they would. And the base would never forget what happened next. At the far edge of the ceremony grounds, behind the last row of chairs, and beyond the reach of any official camera lens, the man in the leather jacket stood alone. No one asked him to move. No one offered him a seat. He didn't mind. He had not come for the ceremony. He had come for a promise. The base was a machine, clean, ordered, disciplined. Yet where he stood, just beyond the polished symmetry, the air felt different, quieter. The wind moved slower there. He adjusted the strap of his duffel, letting the damp fabric settle across his shoulder. Drops from the earlier confrontations still clung to him, but he didn't shake them off. He wasn't in a hurry to be dry. He wasn't in a hurry at all. 2 years earlier, this same man had walked into a very different place. No flags, no folding chairs, no speeches, just a recovery facility near Barstow. The sign had half its paint chipped away. The walls were too thin to keep in the sound of nightmares. He wasn't expected that day. He had flown in under his own name, which no one recognized at the front desk. Just another old guy in boots and a jacket. Just another man who asked if he could sit in on the art therapy room. No press, no announcement, just coffee in one hand and a folded jacket in the other. Inside, a young Navy SEAL sat hunched over a sketchpad, pencil trembling between calloused fingers. His name tag read Flores, but he hadn't spoken in days. The page in front of him held only faint outlines, 3 faces, none of them finished. One was missing eyes, another stopped at the mouth, the third had no name. The therapist had tried everything, group talks, breathing techniques, even guided imagery. Nothing stuck. But then the man with the coffee sat down, 1 chair over, and said nothing. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Just the sound of pencil on paper and the rustle of a styrofoam cup being unwrapped. It went on like that for 5 days. Every morning, same man, same coffee, same chair. Sometimes he brought protein bars, sometimes just silence. On the 3rd day, Flores spoke without looking up. "He died holding my hand," he said. That was it. The man didn't flinch. Just nodded once. On the 5th day, the sketches were finished. Not perfect, but whole. Back at the base, the wind picked up again. Flags flapped harder. A line of officers took their places near the stage. The man in the leather jacket still hadn't moved. No one knew what Reuben Flores was going to say in his speech today. No one had seen his final draft. But the man standing alone already knew. Because he had read it, not on paper, but in every silent moment they had shared in that forgotten room. He hadn't come today for applause. He hadn't come for recognition. He had come because Reuben was going to speak. And he had once said, softly but clearly, "If you ever get your voice back, I'll be there to hear it." That was the kind of promise you didn't break. No one on the base knew that the man in the crowd had once flown rescue missions into canyons no one dared enter. No one remembered that he had delivered medical supplies in remote mountain towns, not for photo ops, but because someone had to. They didn't see that man. They saw a stranger with gray hair, damp shoulders, and old boots. But Reuben Flores would see him, and when he did, everything would change. The final checks were underway. Flags straightened, audio feeds synced, the last camera lens adjusted for light as the echo shield ceremony prepared to begin. Officers filed into formation with practiced precision, their shoes gleaming, medals aligned like clockwork. In the distance, the base commander nodded to his aide. Showtime was minutes away. And yet, in that quiet rhythm of order, one presence disrupted the pulse. The man with the leather jacket still stood alone at the far edge of the field. No badge, no rank, no right to be there, or so it seemed. Petty Officer Raymond Knox spotted him again and cursed under his breath. Knox had served long enough to smell trouble, and in his mind, this man reeked of it, too calm, too still, too far from where he should be. The kind of presence that didn't ask for permission because it didn't think it needed to. Knox pushed through the outer line and marched straight toward him, clipboard under his arm, mirrored sunglasses already in place. Behind him, a civilian therapist noticed. She shifted uncomfortably and looked toward the base chaplain beside her, but he simply shook his head, signaling her to stay out of it. Knox stopped inches from the man's chest. "You again," he said. "Still don't have that name tag." No reply. Knox scanned his list one last time, pretending to care about protocol. "You're not on here, you're not registered. This is a secured event. You're trespassing." The man didn't move. Knox's voice rose just enough to catch the ears of those nearby. "You think you can just walk onto a military base like you belong here, wearing that? You know how many people we turned away this morning. Gold Star families, veterans, but you stroll in like you own the place." Still nothing. The silence grated on him. The man's face was unreadable, not defiant, not frightened, just still. Knox felt the pressure building, eyes watching, ranks shifting. He needed to assert control. He needed this man gone. "Okay, let's make this simple," he snapped. He unscrewed the cap of his water bottle, took a step closer, and without a hint of hesitation, poured it slowly down onto the man's shoulder. The splash echoed louder than it should have. Plastic tapped against canvas. The water seeped through the jacket, darkening the leather in slow, spreading patches. Drops slid down the collarbone, collecting at the hem. The man blinked once. Chairs in the crowd creaked. One officer looked over his shoulder but quickly turned back. A junior ensign murmured something to her neighbor, then fell silent. The therapist clenched her jaw, stepped forward half a stride, then stopped as the chaplain gave her a firm look. She swallowed her protest and stepped back. Knox rolled his shoulders, trying to appear casual. "You hear me? You're not welcome. You're not cleared, you're not on the list. And finally, the man spoke, just 6 words. I'm here for Reuben Flores. It was quiet, no anger, no justification, just a fact. Knox scoffed. Reuben Flores, what are you, his uncle, mentor, another bleeding heart volunteer who thinks listening fixes things? The man didn't answer. Knox's voice sharpened. I don't care who you say you're here for. You're not a part of this, so pick up your bag and go before I call security. The man didn't move. He reached down calmly, lifted his duffel, and held it by the strap. His fingers brushed away a drop of water from the handle like it was dust. Then he looked straight ahead, eyes fixed on the stage. Knox leaned in, voice low, venom tucked behind protocol. You walk in here with no clearance, no ID, and you expect special treatment because what? You once shook a soldier's hand. Silence. Knox turned to the nearest guard, nodding toward the comms unit clipped to his belt. Get the control center. Tell them we've got a civilian refusing to comply. But even as he said it, something shifted. A presence moving across the stage's edge. A figure emerging from behind the canopy. Reuben Flores had arrived. And he had just seen everything. Reuben Flores stepped out from the side tent, his uniform pressed, ribbons aligned, boots polished to mirror shine. This was the moment he had prepared for, the speech he had rewritten a dozen times, the weight of 2 years of recovery compressed into a handful of sentences. He took a breath, rehearsed his opening line silently, and scanned the crowd. Then he froze. 20 feet away, just beyond the camera line, he saw a man standing alone, his jacket soaked, water still dripping from the edge of the collar. Knox stood in front of him, chest puffed, jaw tight. Something had just happened. Reuben could see it in the tension, in the stillness that followed confrontation. The duffel bag, the old boots, the calm presence, and then he saw the face. His breath caught in his throat. Mr. Ford, he said, barely louder than a whisper, then again louder, Mr. Ford. The ceremony paused mid-motion. Officers turned, guests leaned forward. Even the tech crew behind the soundboard froze, fingers hovering over dials. A second of total silence passed, sharp as shattered glass. Someone in the third row squinted. Did he say Ford? Reuben stepped off the path, ignoring the protocol, the script, the flag he was supposed to salute. He walked, no, half-ran toward the man in the soaked jacket. His eyes didn't leave him. Each step brought memory flooding back. The quiet chair in the therapy room, the smell of old coffee, the sound of pencil scratching paper, and the silence, that sacred silence, filled not with absence but with presence. Knox stared, confused. You know this guy. Reuben didn't answer. He stopped 2 feet from the man who had once sat beside him for 5 nights straight, saying nothing, never asking questions. A man who didn't introduce himself, didn't expect thanks, didn't need to be seen. Reuben stood at attention, snapped a crisp salute. His voice cracked but held. Sir, I had no idea you'd come. Harrison gave a faint smile, not smug, not proud, just steady. I promised I'd be here when you spoke. The crowd buzzed. Voices overlapped. Is that really him? Harrison Ford? What's he doing here? But Reuben wasn't finished. He turned toward the gathering, voice louder now, steadier. This man, he said, gesturing to Ford, sat with me when I couldn't speak. He never said his name, never asked for recognition. He just showed up, and he stayed every night until I stopped shaking, until I stopped screaming, until I could look at my own face again. More heads turned. Now it wasn't just a rumor, it was real. Ford stood still, hands in his pockets, watching Reuben, not the crowd. Reuben's voice dropped to a near whisper. If he hadn't been there, I wouldn't be here. Knox took a step back, color draining from his face. The crowd turned toward him now, not with anger, but with a quiet, rising awareness. The man you humiliated wasn't just someone. He was the reason this event existed at all. And no one, not a single soul, had recognized him, until now. Reuben stood behind the podium, hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone. The wind had quieted. The flags hung heavier now, as if even they were waiting. Rows of officers and civilians faced him, but his eyes found only one corner of the field, the man in the leather jacket, still standing, still soaked, still silent. Reuben cleared his throat. His voice came out softer than he expected, but steady. "My name is Reuben Flores," he said, "and I used to believe silence meant weakness." He paused. No one moved. No coughs, no chairs shifting, just stillness. "When I came back," he continued, "I couldn't look people in the eye. I couldn't finish a sentence without seeing ghosts. I couldn't sleep unless I was surrounded by walls and locked doors. I thought healing was a myth. That I was broken in a way no one could fix." A few heads dipped, quiet nods from those who understood, some too well. "Then someone showed up," Reuben said, turning slightly to the side. "Not a doctor, not a chaplain, not a therapist. Just a man, old boots, a leather jacket, a face that didn't flinch when I told him things I'd never said out loud. He took a breath. He never introduced himself, never talked about movies, never told me to man up or get over it. He just sat down every morning, same time, brought coffee, sometimes a protein bar, sat next to me while I tried to draw the faces of 3 men who never came home." Gasps flickered through the audience like sparks on dry grass. Someone whispered, "He was one of the vets." Someone else murmured, "That's not just a guest speaker, is it?" Reuben leaned forward, voice stronger now. "I didn't find out his name until weeks later. And when I did, it didn't make me think more of him. It made me realize how little we know about the people who show up when it matters most." He turned fully now, looking at Harrison Ford. "He didn't want to be mentioned today. Didn't want to be thanked. But I owe my life to that man, and I think you deserve to know what he's done for all of us." Murmurs rippled across the rows. A Marine veteran in the back straightened in his wheelchair. A Gold Star mother clutched her program a little tighter. Reuben took a folded sheet of paper from his pocket and held it up. "This is the original funding report from Echo Shield's founding phase. Most of it came from a handful of anonymous donors, but one name appears again and again under different channels, different methods. Harrison Ford. Over 70% of this program's foundation, training, therapy, infrastructure was paid for out of pocket. Quietly, without a speech, without a plaque. The crowd shifted, not from discomfort, from recognition, from awe. Reuben smiled faintly. He didn't want credit, he wanted us to heal. For a moment, the base held its breath. Then slowly someone stood. A young Marine, dress blues crisp, eyes wide. Then another. An Army veteran with silver hair and trembling hands. Then more. One by one they rose, not for a movie star, not for a hero on screen, but for the man who had walked in alone and stayed when no one asked him to. Knox stood frozen, unable to turn his head, like the weight of realization had anchored him in place. His voice, once loud and commanding, was now a whisper only he could hear. He didn't look at Ford. He couldn't. Reuben folded the sheet and slipped it back into his pocket. "We talk a lot about courage in uniform," he said, "but sometimes the bravest thing you can do is show up quietly and stay long enough to be seen." He looked out across the crowd. That man did, for me, and for many others who didn't even know his name. Harrison Ford remained where he was, eyes calm, hands in his pockets, never stepping forward, never claiming space. But the space around him had already shifted. He didn't need to move, because for the first time that morning, everyone else had. Knox stood motionless, arms at his sides, the clipboard forgotten on the ground. Around him, the crowd remained on their feet, not because someone had told them to, but because they knew they should. The ceremony was no longer about medals or speeches. It had become something else, something heavier. And he was no longer in control of it. He could feel the weight of every gaze, not angry, not accusing, just aware. The kind of attention that strips away uniform and rank and leaves only truth behind. He tried to look anywhere but at the man in the leather jacket, but his eyes kept drifting back. And each time they found calm, not contempt, not pride, just calm. Then footsteps approached from behind, measured, confident, familiar to every ear on that base. Rear Admiral Evelyn Stratton stepped into the clearing with a quiet gravity that made even the Marines stiffen. His presence didn't need introduction. The ribbons on his chest spoke for him. His name whispered down ranks like a current. He stopped beside Knox and surveyed the moment without blinking. "You saw him," Stratton said, voice low but firm, "but you didn't see him." Knox swallowed hard. The Admiral didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You saw what you feared. a man who didn't follow the script, a shape that didn't fit the uniform, so you filled in the rest with your assumptions. Knox opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked down, even his shoes felt too loud. Stratton turned toward Ford, nodding once with a kind of reverence that wasn't performative. It was earned. "Mr. Ford," he said, quieter now, "on behalf of this base and every soul who's found shelter under Echo Shield, I extend our formal apology." Ford didn't speak at first. He glanced at Knox, then at Stratton, then out toward the field where Reuben still stood, eyes locked on him. When he finally spoke, it was soft, almost a breath, but somehow it reached every corner. "I'm not angry," he said. "I've seen worse done with louder voices." He stepped forward one pace, not toward Stratton or the crowd, but toward Knox. "But the next time someone walks onto your field and doesn't look the way you expect," he said, pausing, "don't check for clearance. Check your instinct." The moment held, not dramatic, not theatrical, just human. Knox looked up, and for the first time that day, he saw the man in front of him not as a problem, not as a mistake, but as a mirror. Stratton broke the silence with a single sentence that would be repeated on bases across the country. "Respect doesn't start with a title, it starts with presence." And in that instant, the shift wasn't just felt by Knox. It rippled outward to the guests, the officers, the command. No punishment was issued, no reprimand delivered, because this wasn't a moment for correction. It was a moment for change. The ceremony ended not with a round of applause, but with silence. Not emptiness, but reverence. The kind that doesn't ask for more. The kind that understands enough has been said. High-ranking officers tried to approach him. A few journalists, tipped off at the last minute, hovered at a distance, unsure if they were allowed to come closer. Cameras stayed on, waiting for a statement, a moment, a headline, but Harrison Ford didn't speak. He didn't give interviews. He didn't linger for photographs. He stood for a moment beneath the lowering sun, eyes scanning the field, not for recognition, but for Reuben. When their eyes met, Ford offered a small nod. That was all. Then he turned. Before anyone could ask where he was going, before anyone could prepare a send-off or a farewell, he disappeared behind the main tent. No security detail, no SUV with tinted windows, just footsteps on pavement. Minutes later, a folded manila envelope appeared on the base commander's desk. No return address, no seal. Inside was a single note written in ink that bled slightly at the edges. The handwriting was clean, deliberate. "Next time, look at the person, not the name tag." There was no signature, but everyone knew who it came from. Back on the field, Reuben returned to his seat, only to find something tucked inside his side pouch. It hadn't been there earlier. A notebook worn at the edges, its corners folded like someone had carried it too long. He flipped it open and stopped. It was the same sketchbook, the one he had left behind when he checked out of the recovery facility. The same pages filled with the half-drawn faces of his brothers, the lines once jagged, now complete. On the inside cover, scrawled in that same hand, "Keep drawing so others can be seen." Reuben didn't cry, but he held the notebook like something sacred. No one saw Ford leave. He didn't walk out the main gate. He didn't shake hands on his way out. A maintenance staff member later said they saw a man in a damp jacket exit quietly through the service path, past a row of supply crates, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. He didn't wave, didn't look back. He didn't need to. Because the moment he showed up, everything changed. And the moment he left, no one was quite the same. 1 week later, the video surfaced, shot from a handheld phone, shaky, a little overexposed, but raw, real. The moment Petty Officer Raymond Knox poured water onto the shoulder of a man he believed was a nobody. The same clip cut to Reuben Flores sprinting from the stage, shouting 2 words that would echo across the internet: "Mr. Ford." The caption underneath read simply, "He didn't need to be seen to matter." Within hours, the hashtag spread. "You didn't see him." Veterans reposted it with quiet defiance. Teachers, nurses, single parents. People who had been dismissed, overlooked, misread, not because of what they did, but because of how they looked. A retired Army sergeant wrote, "I wear sweatpants and limp. A cop once told me to move along because I looked off. I wasn't drunk, I was remembering Kabul. The movement grew, not around a celebrity, around a truth, a hard one, that we often see what we expect, not what's in front of us. And sometimes the person we ignore is the one holding everything together. Back on base, Knox sat at a small desk in the counseling wing. His uniform was still pressed, but the sharpness in his posture was gone. He'd requested to assist Echo Shield's intake desk voluntarily. He no longer judged those who arrived without polished boots or perfect paperwork. He saw them, because now he understood what it meant to miss something vital, what it meant to be wrong. He wrote a letter, not for publicity, not for forgiveness. Mr. Ford, I thought I was doing my job. I thought procedure was the same as honor, but then I saw you. And I realized how many times I've chosen the checklist over compassion. You taught me something I didn't learn in training. Thank you for showing up, even when we didn't deserve it. He folded the letter, left it unsealed, and placed it in the same inbox where requests for speaker engagements usually sat. But this one wasn't meant for show. Outside, at the entrance to Echo Shield's facility, a new plaque had been mounted. Brushed steel, no logo, no names, to those who stayed when others walked away. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was anything but. Reuben stood in front of it the next morning, holding his sketchbook under one arm. He didn't touch the plaque, he just read it once, then looked up at the flag swaying overhead. He didn't need to say anything. Across the country, new conversations began, in classrooms, in precincts, in boardrooms, in barracks. People asked not who someone was on paper, but who they were in presence. The Echo Shield speech became required viewing in a few training academies, not because it was powerful, but because it was honest. Harrison Ford never responded publicly. He didn't issue a statement, didn't appear on late-night talk shows or news segments, but someone found a package weeks later tucked beneath a cot in the intake room. Inside was a stack of clean sketchbooks and one note: you don't have to be loud to be remembered, you just have to stay when it counts. No signature, just the initials, HF. In the end, the story wasn't about a mistake or a salute or a name, it was about attention, the kind we pay, the kind we withhold, and the kind that could change a life if only we'd slow down enough to see it. Because sometimes the most honorable people are the ones we almost missed. And the strongest voices are the ones we never hear, until they're gone. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.